All right, and we'll get started now. Welcome everyone to our bi-weekly lecture series with GOWME, the Global Organization for Wilderness Medicine Education. If this is your first time here, we've been around for about 3 years now, and the reason that we're still here is largely thanks to our audience. So thank you so much for participating. My name's Nate. I'm a second-year medical student at the State University of New York, headquartered at Syracuse. Um, and really like this program, really passionate about wilderness medicine, so it's so great to share this with all of you. So here at GOWME, our mission again, we aim to create an educational platform where interested students and healthcare professionals can explore and interact with these really fascinating subfields. We like to showcase the diverse ways that physicians and other healthcare professionals can create impacts and inspire others to really explore and think abstractly about all these really cool applications that we can have in our future careers. And we also aim to create an international community of wilderness medicine enthusiasts who are all committed to promoting a diverse and culturally competent environment. So if you're interested in GOWME and you want to learn more, feel free to scan this QR code. In addition to these bi-weekly lectures, we have a host of opportunities here, a bunch of really neat certification courses, and sometimes we even give away free stuff. We're active on Instagram, and all of our lectures can be found on our YouTube channel as well, so make sure you check that out. This is another cool opportunity coming up in just under a month. For any of you who are located in the Mid-Atlantic region of the United States, this conference, I've checked it out on their website. There's a bunch of really cool speakers who are lined up to present. And I believe for med students, it's only $50. I don't think the price goes up that much if you're farther along in your training. But I think this looks like a really cool opportunity. So we'll drop a link about this in the chat during our event tonight. We have free stuff to give away. So we have partnered with Pit Viper. They have a bunch of cool swag. If you want some of it, we're going to drop another link in the chat. All you have to do is a Google form. The Google form will prompt you to just say, hey, I was there at the lecture, and that'll put your name in a hat, and we will draw names sometime later this semester. This is the rest of our lineup for this year. Our next speaker is still to be announced, but we have a bunch of really cool topics coming in hot for the rest of the semester. So we hope to see you again for at least some of those. So that brings us to our presenter today, Dr. Cecily Swinburne. Dr. Swinburne is an emergency medicine physician with special interests in EMS and wilderness medicine. She first became involved in EMS in college when she joined the Mount Desert Island Search and Rescue, which is a volunteer technical rescue team working primarily in Acadia National Park. She then went on to work for the National Park Service as a backcountry ranger, mostly at Olympic National Park. And she also worked as an EMT and a ski patroller in the off seasons. Eventually, she decided that she wanted more education, so she did a bunch more training, including an EMS fellowship. And after this today, she's currently the medical advisor for Acadia National Park and continues to be an active member of the technical rescue team. So that's all I've got. I'm going to introduce Cecily next. If anyone has any questions during this presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can wait until the very end and ask it in person. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen. And Cecily, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Thanks so much for the introduction, Nate. Let me just share my screen here. All right. So as Nate said, I am going to be talking about search and rescue and EMS in the national parks, and specifically in Acadia National Park, because that's where I have the most experience and it's where I am currently working. And it's also where I met Nate when he was working up here over the summer. I've got no financial disclosures, and just a reminder that I am speaking from my own personal experiences. I'm not representing the National Park Service or any of the other organizations that I work with. So just a brief outline of my talk for today. I'm going to start off sort of talking about a little bit about my background, how I got involved in this work. And then I'm going to give an overview of EMS and search and rescue in mostly Acadia. And then I'm going to talk about a few of the cases that I've been involved with. And finally, we should have some time for questions at the end. So before medical school, I first got involved in this stuff when I was in college. I joined the Mount Desert Island Search and Rescue Team up here in Acadia. I went to school in Bar Harbor, and sorry. Why can't I? Sorry about that. All right. So I went to school here in Bar Harbor, Maine. I joined the Mount Desert Island Search and Rescue Team. It's an all-volunteer team that does SAR primarily in Acadia, but also throughout the state of Maine. And when I went to college, I was thinking, I really like math. I really like medicine. Just kind of thinking bioinformatics. Academically, that was interesting, but I realized I really like spending time out working with patients. Loved the SAR work I was doing. So after graduating from college, I decided to work for the National Park Service. So I spent 4 years working as a backcountry ranger at Olympic National Park. I did some other seasons. I spent a winter season at Mount Rainier out in Washington State as well. And then I did some shorter stints both in Colorado and down on the Natchez Trace Parkway in Mississippi. I love the work. It was a great way to see the country, meet interesting people. But the seasonal aspect of being a park ranger was tiring. And I realized that at some point, I was going to want to be able to settle in one place and not be sort of constantly applying for my next job. So I thought about sort of going for a permanent position in the Park Service, but there were sort of few positions that really would allow me to do a lot of SAR and EMS. And so I decided that going to medical school and becoming a physician was probably a better career path. And then I would, try and get back out into the field as much as possible. And so that's what I did. I went to medical school through the Tufts Main Track program. So 2 years in Boston and then 2 years up here in Maine. And then after medical school, I did my residency in Albany, New York at Albany Medical Center. So I spent 3 years in an emergency medicine residency there, and then stayed on for a year to do a EMS fellowship. So that's focused in pre-hospital medicine. I finished my formal training just over a year ago now and moved back to Maine, which was really what I wanted to do. So I am full-time emergency physician in Bangor, Maine at Northern Light Eastern Maine Medical Center. It's a level 2 trauma center. It's we have one family med residency up here and some medical students that rotate through, but primarily a community shop with a huge catchment area. The only sort of other large hospitals in the state are in Augusta and then down in Portland, Maine. So we get a huge catchment area across northern Maine. And then I also work per diem at MDI Hospital, which is down in Bar Harbor. It's a critical access hospital right outside of the park. And I work with a local paramedic program with a community college and then with Acadia National Park. And I'm still on the SAR team. So just to give you a sense of the geography of the area, when we say Acadia National Park, most of it's on Mount Desert Island. That's where the vast majority of visitation is. It's this island, in the middle of your screen there. It's connected by a causeway. Sometimes you'd honestly forget it was an island until the causeway gets backed up with traffic or there's a car crash on the causeway and you realize there's no way to drive around. But easy to get to. And then there are a couple other sort of sites. The Scudic Peninsula is about an hour north up the coast. And then Isla Ho is actually an island off the coast. They have to take a ferry to. So also parts of Acadia National Park, but they get the vast majority of visitation is to even just the eastern half of Mount Desert Island. Looking more closely at the island, when you look at that map, all the green area is national park. So you can see that the park is takes up a lot of the geography of the island. but it is surrounded by communities. So the largest community on the island is Bar Harbor, up on the top right of the map. And then there's northeast and southwest, kind of the southern part of the island. The year-round population is about 10,000 people, about 100 square miles. And then every year we get about 4 million visitors coming to Acadia. And that visitation is really focused between about Memorial Day and Indigenous Peoples Day. So in the few months of the summer, we get 4 million people coming to our island that usually has about 10,000 people. So it gets really crowded. With the geography of the park, though, and the surrounding towns, that builds into how we respond to EMS and SAR incidents. So there are 3 EMS agencies on the island, one in each of the towns, and they are our transport units for anything that happens in the park. They're all licensed as ALS or paramedic level agencies. However, like staffing around the country, they're not all fully staffed. So Bar Harbor's the only one that's guaranteed to always have a paramedic on. The others often do, but we can't count on it. So, it's possible that we would have only one paramedic currently working for the entire island. But sometimes we have up to, 3 or 4. And then Acadia National Park, we have our own staff who provide EMS and SAR response, but we're all a non-transport unit. And so we work closely with our surrounding ambulance services. Let's see, I got a bunch of chats here. All right, none of it's relevant right now. So sort of talking about SAR in the national park service as a whole. This is a quote from Stephen Mather, who is the first director of the NPS, and it was, "If the trail is to be blazed, send a ranger. If an animal is floundering in the snow, send a ranger. If a bear is in a hotel, send a ranger. If a fire threatens a forest, send a ranger. And if someone needs to be saved, send a ranger." And so while, the Park Service as a whole has transformed a lot in the last, just over 100 years, since it was first created in the early 1900s, that piece of it has not actually changed a whole lot. The Rangers are kind of jacks of all trades, and they do law enforcement, SAR, EMS, and fire. Now, the specific roles of a park ranger is going to vary a lot between different parks. Some are very law enforcement heavy, some are very EMS heavy, but overall, being a park ranger, most of them do all 3 of these. There has been a little bit more of a trend towards separating law enforcement out, recognizing that it's requires a lot of sort of special training and to maintain those skills. And so, for example, Acadia this last year was the first year that we hired general rangers. So these were rangers that didn't do law enforcement. And that's actually what Nate was doing up in Acadia this last year. So still does a lot of sort of visitor services and, traffic and parking and providing information. And then one of their primary responsibilities was to respond to SAR and EMS calls. In Acadia specifically, as I said, we're all BLS non-transport unit. Most of the rangers are EMTs, and we're not licensed as a main EMS agency. We're actually operating under a National Park Service emergency medical services protocols. So these are for all the parks across the country. But as I said, the parks vary greatly, right? We've got very different demands here in Acadia where everything's pretty accessible, as opposed to, say, up in some of the Alaska parks where they are true wilderness and very resource limited. And so, what you need to respond to an EMS call, up in Glacier Bay is going to be very different than what we need here in Acadia. So there is some flexibility to tailor your protocols at a local level. Also the terrain varies greatly, right? We've got high altitude, like up on Mount Rainier, as opposed to the heat protocols that might be more relevant down in the Grand Canyon. The National Park Service protocols do allow for some expanded scope of practice beyond what you would recognize in most BLS protocols, state protocols. So things like allowing for shoulder reductions, patella reductions at an EMT level are included in the Park Service protocols. Other things have kind of actually trended towards becoming more common, even in urban EMS agencies, things like over-the-counter pain medication. We've been allowing our rangers to give Tylenol and ibuprofen for a long time, and I'm actually seeing that more now in urban protocols. For Acadia, we average about 100 EMS calls a year. I know that that's an underestimate because that's based off of the number of patient care reports that I see. With our geography, if a 911 call goes to our county dispatch, and it's for a call that's, I'll call it, front country, so roadside, easy to get to, requesting an ambulance, they'll send both the park ranger and the ambulance. And it's not uncommon for the ambulance to be the first on scene, in which case they take over sort of primary medical care. And usually we don't write a patient care report from the park service if we're not the first unit on scene. So we document about 100 EMS calls a year. We probably have maybe 150. And then besides EMS, for all the search and rescue calls, we've got Mount Desert Island Search and Rescue, which is that volunteer team that I talked about. So we don't provide medical care, but for all the patients that aren't easily accessed by vehicle, if you have to do a carry out or if you have to do any kind of technical rope rescue, the volunteer team gets called out, and we average about 25 calls a year. When we look at our response, what are we usually seeing? The vast majority of our calls are going to be isolated lower extremity musculoskeletal injuries. I got a lot of people out hiking, and they twist ankles, break ankles, injure their knees, that kind of stuff. Probably the second most common are going to be our bike crashes. We have carriage roads. They're gravel roads. They were initially built by the Rockefellers to ride their horses and horse-drawn carriages on. And now they remain closed to vehicles, but they're open to bikes and horses and hiking. And so it's a great place for people to go out and ride their bikes. But we've seen people go too fast around corners, skid out on the gravel, and we get a lot of road rash and other bike crashes. We've also seen a huge uptick in e-bikes and e-bike crashes. I don't have the numbers on it, but my sense is that a lot of the crashes we're seeing these days are actually related to e-bikes. I think you get people who aren't as comfortable on bicycles. They see an e-bike as a way to get out and cover a lot of territory without actually having to be comfortable on a bike, and they go faster and they weigh more. And so we're seeing a lot of crashes with that. And then rocky coastal cliffs is a lot of what people come to Acadia for. So people slip and fall in the rocks. We have some climbing. That's actually generally not a huge source of our SAR and EMS calls. Usually our climbers know what they're doing and either self-rescue or don't have significant injuries. But occasionally we do have a significant rock climbing incident. And then we get 4 million people coming to this tiny area. So we get all the medical calls that aren't necessarily park related, but asthma, chest pain, seizures, all that stuff happens as well, and we respond to that. There are sort of state roads that cut through park property. There's some car crashes on that. On the primary park roads, I think the speed limit on almost all of them is 25, and for the summer, you'd be lucky to go that. So you clip a lot of mirrors, but there aren't a lot of injuries from car crashes on the purely park roads. And then there's swimming, boating, that kind of stuff, which is far less common. When we look at about sort of planning our response, how are we going to get these patients out? First, if they're able to walk, we are going to assist them in doing that. So we'll often hike in like a walking boot, post-op shoe type thing, and either crutches or hiking poles, and assist a patient in ambulating if they're able to do so. If they're not, then they'll often get put into a litter and we carry them. So either that's just a standard carry, or this photo here, the large one, you can see there's like a bike tire underneath it. So if it's a even enough trail, we can use the litter wheel to assist in moving a litter. And then Elsewhere, sometimes we have to use technical rope systems. So on some of the vertical cliffs along the coast, we'll set up a high angle system. That was an actual night rescue a few years ago where someone had fallen off a cliff. Up in the top right-hand corner, that's a high line. So carrying a litter over a boulder field is a lot of work and difficult to do. So sometimes it's easier to actually set up essentially a zip line with a few more controls so that the patient has a controlled rate of descent, but to just, float above the boulder field and evacuate a patient that way. There are some trails that go around lakes. And so sometimes we can get the patient into a boat and use the boat to transport them back to a boat launch and evacuate them that way. In the winter, the carriage roads are open for skiing and some of them are open for snowmobiling. We can often use a snowmobile to evacuate patients in the winter. And then helicopter is another option. So we have the Maine Forest Service, which is our agency that does hoist. And can hoist someone off of the side of a mountain. And then this helicopter in this picture is actually Life Flight, which is our helicopter EMS service for the state. And usually we meet them in a parking lot or on a field, but a couple times they've actually landed on the summit of a mountain, and we can bring a patient directly to them that way. Just a little bit more about litter carrying, because that is the vast majority of what we do. If you've never had the opportunity to carry a litter, it is a worthwhile experience and eye-opening to see just how much is involved in carrying someone for an extended period of time. At minimum, it takes 6 people at a time on the litter. And then a lot of our trails are rocky and steep. So we'll often have to pass over difficult sections. So we'll actually line people up in 2 rows and start passing. So, you get yourself into a place where you've got steady footing and then pass the litter down the line. And once the litter's past you, you kind of run around the outside, around whatever the obstacle is, the steep section of trail, and get below. And we just kind of we call it like caterpillaring, passing a litter down a trail. There are places where we also use ropes just to belay the litter, either to take some of the weight of the litter or to actually keep the litter to falling. If it was the edge of a cliff or something like that, where if we were to lose control of the litter, we want it tied to something so that it doesn't slide out of control. All right, so that's sort of an overview of SAR, who's responding, what are some of the issues that we're working with. So now I have a couple cases that I wanted to talk about. So the first one, this was actually, I think it was my first vacation in residency. So I came back up to Maine for a week, and this call went out at about 7:30 in the morning. It was a woman and her husband had gone up Door Mountain to watch sunrise, and they were hiking down. And this photo on the left was taken probably moments before the incident occurred. She's in this little cave-ish thing, and hanging on that boulder there. And that boulder then let loose, and you can see over here on the right, that rock is what landed on her leg. So we get a call for a woman with a leg injury up on the ladder trail of Door Mountain. If you have experience looking at topographic maps, that arrow points to about where she was. The red line is the road. So distance-wise, it's not that far. You could actually see almost to her from the road. But those topo lines are pretty close together. It's a pretty steep trail. So that creates some challenges in how to evacuate her. It is called the ladder trail for a reason. One of the things about Acadia is we have some pretty impressive trail building. It makes it an interesting place to hike, but it also makes it an interesting place to rescue people. So throughout a lot of our trails, we have iron rungs and ladders, and that is why this trail is called the ladder trail. So that photo on the left is some of the iron rungs that have been placed to get hikers up, but creates certain challenges when we're trying to evacuate a patient in a litter. There's some narrow sections. So all the way on the right there where that dog is, you can walk through that no problem, but it's not wide enough to fit a litter through. And then that staircase in the middle, it's built one across, right? It's built for single file people hiking up it. It's not designed for 3 people across carrying a litter. And with that solid rock wall on the left there, you can't get anyone, that's a barrier. You can't get anyone further left of the trail. So you end up having one person kind of walk up the stairs, and then the other side is scrambling off trail, which makes it's difficult travel. All right. So for this patient in particular, we hiked up to her and put her leg in a splint and got her in a litter. One of the things you can see in that photo all the way on the left of her in a litter is the different colored t-shirts. So the person in the foreground wearing the navy blue shirt and American flag patch, she's working with the ambulance service. So she's Bar Harbor paramedic, and she was called up there to provide pain medication. The yellow shirts that you see, those are National Park Service employees. So those are our rangers. And then the orange shirts are the volunteers. So those are all members of MDI Search and Rescue. So what we did is we put her in a litter, and then instead of going down the trail where there were some ladders, we decided to bypass the actual trail and do what we call like a steep angle lower. So we attached a rope system to it. We lowered the litter, and 3 of us tied into the litter directly down a steep section that paralleled the trail to get onto a more exposed ledge. And then we called a helicopter with the Forest Service, and they hoisted her out. So you can see the Forest Service ranger there with his flight helmet on, dressed in all green. They lower him in, they put the patient, we call it a screamer suit. So it's essentially like a diaper harness, 5-point harness. Patient's just sitting up, attached to the rope at the end of the helicopter, and they fly externally from the side of the mountain over to the ball field where they landed. The reason that we use the screamer suit on that is because of availability. The Forest Service has one, they call it a Bowman bag. It's a large bag that you can put a whole litter in and hoist it. There was one in the state, and it wasn't at the Bangor office when we called for the helicopter. So instead of flying from somewhere else in the state to get it, they went with the screamer suit. So talking about the injury, I will give you guys a warning. I did animate this so that the gory picture doesn't pop up initially, but there's a gory picture here that I will show you. So to say that she crushed her leg is an understatement. The bones were shattered. Here you go. So that was her leg when she first got to the hospital. Lots of soft tissue injury, and the bone is crushed. And you can see the red there is actually a t-shirt. Her husband had actually pushed the rock off of her leg, and tried to stop the bleeding with a t-shirt. We then, added more supplies to try and stop the bleeding and put it in a vacuum splint to support it. Some of the challenges there were it bled a lot. With something this crushed, a tourniquet actually probably would have been a better option to get that bleeding controlled. You just don't have the stability and structure of the bones to press against to get the bleeding to stop otherwise. And then pain control. So we had the paramedics hike in and provide pain control to her while we evacuated her. She actually posted really publicly about her experience and recovery from this injury on Facebook. And a couple years ago, when I was giving another talk to a wilderness medicine interest group in Albany, I reached out to her, and she gave me permission to share all the photos from her Facebook page. So it's been several years, many surgeries, so at least 15 surgeries over the course of 4 years. I know she was told early on that she would probably be back on her feet faster if they amputated her leg. She decided not to do that, and has gone through a long recovery process. But you can see that photo from April of 2022. I mean, she's up hiking again. That's actually in a gym. She was working out. And it was actually kind of interesting. I don't usually get this kind of feedback from patients, but she stayed in touch with the team to some extent, sent us a thank you card and some water bottles, actually. And then some of the people on our team had been in touch with her. So it's kind of interesting to hear how she had done, which is follow-up we often don't get. All right, next call. So this was just last year. We get a call for someone who had fallen near Thunder Hole. So Thunder Hole, so Ocean Drive is a region of Acadia, which is very popular. The park road runs right along it, and then there's this trail called Ocean Path that runs between the coast and the road. And then there are a number of places where people can get down and walk along the rocks. Thunder Hole is a rock feature that tends to, the waves come crashing in there, and because it's undercut, it makes a sound of thunder and you get big waves at certain tides. So a popular area, they've actually built a staircase and an observation deck there. So we had actually just, the volunteer team had just finished a training and we were sitting around chatting. And when this call came in right up the street, so we actually responded right away. I responded on foot, just hiking down this trail. And as we approach Thunder Hole, we see a rollator walker right off to the side of the trail. And at first we joked, we're like, ha, hope that's not our patient. Well, turns out it was. This guy had decided that he wanted to get down on the rocks, and instead of waiting to where there was a established staircase and sort of sidewalk, he'd taken a social trail or a non-maintained trail to get down there. And a lot of people do that, but he gets around with a walker at baseline, so probably wasn't the best option for him. He was actually visiting the area on a cruise ship. We get a lot of cruise ship passengers. They get in tour buses and get dropped off at different sites along the park to explore for the day. So that was what he was doing. So he had left his rollator up on the main trail and walked down this really uneven, relatively steep and rooted rocky trail to get closer to the ocean. And unfortunately, he had a fall. He was also wearing Crocs. Yeah, and unfortunate. So he's a 56-year-old. Call was that he had sort of fallen while hiking near Thunder Hole, and he was reporting neck pain and he was unable to get up. So when we get there, we see, it looks like he had tripped on a root and fallen forward. He's awake, talking to us, but laying sort of head downhill with an abrasion on his forehead, complaining of neck pain. And he was unable to move his arms and could only wiggle his toes when we first got there. It looked like he had tripped and fallen forward and struck his forehead on a tree or a branch and hyperextended his neck. It was interesting, like medically interesting, because he actually had a progressive neurologic exam during the short time that we were with him. So when we first got there, he was able to move his legs a little bit throughout maybe the 20 minutes we were with him. By the end of that, he could no longer move his legs and he was having progressive sensory loss below the neck. So we had the paramedics come meet us on scene. We got him in a litter, carried him up to the road. It was only a couple 100 feet. It was not a long carry out. I think there were only about 8 of us involved, and that was plenty for this situation. And then the park and the paramedics made the decision that, he clearly had a spinal injury. We have nothing that we can really do for that at our critical access hospital. We knew he needed to go to the larger referral center in Bangor. And so we decided to call Life Flight. And so we actually had them meet us at the ball field in town. And so we loaded him into an ambulance, drove him to the ball field, and loaded him onto a helicopter. So he went directly to Bangor and bypassed our local hospital in order to get him up to a hospital that had neurosurgery capabilities. And so what do they find? So this is actually a copy of his CT scan. By the time he got there, he wasn't moving his arms, legs, and he had no sensation below his neck. And the CT scan showed he actually has a whole bunch of bone spurs. And he essentially had a fused cervical spine, which he was probably unaware of prior to this incident. And what happened is when he hyperextended his neck, one of those spurs broke off, and it's at the C3, C4 level. and it was causing severe spinal stenosis and crushing the cord there. So hyperflexion injury, he had central cord syndrome. What they ended up doing is they did take him to the OR a couple days later to do a laminectomy and fuse his cervical spine. He spent about a month in Bangor for that initial treatment, and then he was from the West Coast. So after a month, they arranged for him to be transferred by a medical transport plane back to a rehab facility closer to his home to make it easier for him and family. And by the time he left Bangor, which is sort of the end of when I know anything about his care, he had regained most of the sensory. He had most of his sensation back, and then he had some movement of his left arm. But yeah, a devastating injury to go from walking to essentially a paraplegic with just very limited movement of his left arm. All right. Another case. So this was back in 2009 when I was first working for the park. We get hurricanes up here. So this is also along Ocean Drive. It was Hurricane Bill. The forecast was for huge surf and waves. And so we get a lot of people who come to watch waves. That view on the right, that photo, that's Otter Cliffs. Those are about 80 to 100-foot cliffs. It's where a lot of the rock climb, or one of the common rock climbing areas, and you have waves crashing up over them. There were an estimated 10,000 people along Ocean Drive, which is just a couple mile section of road that day, watching the waves. And late morning, we get a report that one of the waves crashed up on the rocks where people were sitting, and several people were swept into the water. So it's a mass casualty incident. We had very few rangers sort of on Ocean Path at the time, and no idea how many patients we had, how many people were missing. One of the things that we allow in the park, so it's the main road is a one-way, two-lane road, and we allow parking in the right-hand lane. With that, it becomes a one-lane, one-way road. And there's actually, we call them coping stones. They're, large chunks of granite that actually line the other side of the road along Ocean Drive and separate the trail from the road. So you can't really just sort of get off the road and drive around. So this created some challenges in responding to the scene for emergency traffic. I was on foot actually down there checking out the waves myself when the call went out. So I responded on foot, and I was actually the second person from the park on scene because no one else could get there. We could actually hear, the sirens from ambulances and other rangers responding, but it sounded like forever, or felt like forever before they actually showed up on scene because of the traffic. So you've got cars parked all the way down the road in the right-hand lane, and then people trying to leave in the left-hand lane. What they ended up doing, if you look at the map, there are a whole bunch of parking areas. Those are like little pullouts. Park staff just kept trying to get people out of the road and pushed into these parking lots to allow access to the road. And you can see down below, I mean, those people are being idiots, quite frankly, but that's similar to what happened. We had a lot of people sitting on rocks down by where the waves were crashing. A wave came in that was bigger than the previous ones, and a bunch of people got swept out, and we had no idea how many people were affected. So the first task was getting first responders in, getting the ambulances and park rangers there to get the known injured people out. There were a number of people that had been able to, who were either just knocked down or able to get to shore on their own. So I had a patient with an open tib fib fracture that I was working with. I know there was a woman with a broken femur that was nearby. So first trying to get EMS in to evacuate those patients. And then we started trying to figure out, okay, who are we missing? There were family members that reported some other people missing. So we knew that there were people who were unaccounted for. But we just tried to get all the vehicles out, everybody back in their car at Ocean Drive, and to see, are there unclaimed vehicles? and even then, they could be hiking, they could be someplace else. We don't know that they're in the ocean, but trying to figure that out. So what ended up happening after figured it out was about 20 people who were knocked down, swept into the ocean initially. 17 of them were able to get on shore on their own. 3 were swept out to sea. The Coast Guard, we have a Coast Guard base in Southwest Harbor, so one of the towns on the island. They were out there in their boat searching, and then they actually also brought up a plane and helicopter from Cape Cod, which by road is quite a distance, but by air is actually pretty close. So they were there pretty quickly, and they were searching the ocean offshore by helicopter and by their Falcon jet, and were able to find the 3 people that were missing in the water. They transported a total of about 10 people. Most of those were the people who had been knocked down right on the rocks. 1 person died. There was a 7-year-old who died, and 2 other people, one of whom was her father, and one was a teenager, who were pulled from the water by the Coast Guard. And then this traffic sign is actually from just a couple weeks ago when Hurricane Lee came up. So, when we're planning for SAR and EMS response, a big piece of this is prevention. So for Hurricane Lee, they actually shut down Ocean Drive, so there were no vehicles there. You could walk there, though, so there are plenty of people out, but it eliminates the challenge of getting vehicles in should they have to respond to anything, and it keeps some of the people out. You don't get 10,000 people there when you have to walk in. And then just signs warning people of the obvious, but that there is dangerous surf, and to try and get people to make good decisions and watch out for their own well-being. All right. So I just wanted to end sort of talking about what's my role. I know a lot of you are medical students looking sort of forward to life after training. What opportunities do you have? So, while I like getting out there and, doing rope rescue training and taking care of patients, a lot of my role as the local emergency medical advisor, as the Park Service refers to us, is more administrative. So a lot of what I do is reviewing calls. I go through a lot of the patient care reports from the rangers over the summer, and, make sure that we're providing good care to patients, and try to, learn from the cases that we've seen, and teach the rangers and sort of offer ongoing trainings to improve our medical response. I'm available to provide med control. So I occasionally get calls from rangers either on the radio or by phone saying, hey, I'm out with this patient. I got questions. What should I do? And so we sort of talk through cases, and I'm able to either provide orders, or just we can talk through, how should we manage this? Often, I think the most common thing I get called for are people with head injuries or intoxicated who don't really want to go to the hospital, and the ranger's trying to figure out, is this appropriate? Other things I do, I talked about being able to tailor the park protocols to local needs. So as the national park protocols have evolved, this has become, we have fewer park specific ones for Acadia, but things like Tylenol, ibuprofen, and reductions, and check and eject epinephrine as opposed to EpiPens are all sort of park specific protocols initially. Most of those have actually been adopted by the Park Service as a whole. And then teaching and doing ongoing trainings, both search and rescue and EMS with the rangers. And then the part that I like the most is, actually getting out there, go on a fair number of calls with the SAR team. And then I also get on some of the just straight EMS calls, either by just being in the park or doing ride-alongs with the rangers. And then the other thing I do is oversee, a lot of sort of planning preparation of the EMS program, including the AED program. One of the challenges here is there's a lot of seasonal variation. So in the summer, some of the AEDs are kept in like visitor centers, restaurants, like high use areas, but those all close in the winter. So we actually have to have sort of a summer and a winter AED plan, how we, do we keep the AEDs in vehicles or in buildings? And the answer is both, but that changes seasonally. And then lastly, I mean, most of the EMS work that I do is directed towards visitors, but the rangers are mostly law enforcement rangers as well. So this year I got the opportunity to go to instructor training for tactical EMS for federal agencies. And with that, we've actually been teaching some tactical EMS trainings for our staff. So teaching them buddy aid, self aid, to keep themselves safe should a tactical event occur in the park. All right, that's what I got. Any questions? I'll open it up for questions. You can either write them in the chat or feel free to unmute and ask them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cecily. That was great. It's fun to see these some of these pictures look kind of familiar. So yeah, feel free to drop any questions in the chat or unmute yourself. So if you want to share video too, we welcome that as well. I do have a question maybe while people are thinking of something, but I guess, like, do you see any big changes coming to Acadia in the next couple years as far as like EMS protocols go or anything like that in the pipeline?
Yeah, probably not protocols. So one of the things that I maybe alluded to is just the shortage of paramedics on the island and sort of the challenges that creates. So all the rangers are working at a BLS level, which means that we don't carry any kind of narcotic pain control. And a lot of our patients have very painful, like isolated extremity trauma, and they're often if you're up a trail, it often takes a couple hours to get them out. And we, try to be as smooth in that as possible, but being bounced down a trail in a litter with a broken leg is not comfortable. And so we try to provide pain control from them. And currently we have to call one of the surrounding agencies and get a paramedic up trail. Now, if you think about EMS and EMS response as a whole for the island, we are pulling a paramedic off of one of those trucks for several hours to provide pain control. And that's great for that patient, but that could potentially be the only paramedic on the island at a time. And when you have, thousands and thousands of visitors in town, what if you get someone in respiratory distress? What if you have someone with, status epilepticus or chest pain, cardiac arrest? It's not a good use of our resources there. So we do have, I'm continuing to work to try and find other options to provide sort of additional depth to our ALS response in the park. I'm not the only physician on the team. So one of the things we're looking at is, can we get the other physician, myself and the other physicians on the team, access to narcotic pain control? The other thing we're actually looking at is more regional pain control. So doing things like hematoma blocks for fractures. One of the docs that I work with in Bangor is also military. And so he has a lot of experience caring for traumatic injuries in remote areas. And so sort of talking with him about some other ideas, what could we do? So that's one of the things I'm working on. All right, I see a couple here, a couple questions. What do I recommend getting involved or preparing during medical school? Stay sane. I feel like during medical school, you have very limited time to do other things. Certainly, participating in wilderness medicine conferences and lectures. I think the biggest thing you can do is actually make contacts. So, and take advantage actually of lower cost for medical school stuff, or if your school will support you going to any conferences, if you can get a poster in someplace. I feel like those connections that you make, a lot of us in the wilderness medicine community enjoy teaching and want to help med students get involved. And so sort of take advantage of that, reach out to people doing interesting things, see if you can get involved in a project, or just sort of make that contact so that when you have a little more time as a resident, or post training, you have some of those contacts established and they can help sort of direct you into cool opportunities. Um, yeah, but and I think during medical school also just, getting out and hiking, biking, whatever your, recreation of choice is, going to interesting talks, that kind of stuff goes a long way. There will be time. It gets better after medical school for sure. Um, Having camped in the shelters on Isle of Ho, how do you cover response there? Great question. So we have one general ranger out there. So we have an EMT on Isle of Ho for the summer. There is a year-round community on Isle of Ho as well. So they have their own sort of EMS fire department type response. The park and the town work closely, recognizing that, you have one ranger there. They're not gonna be able to take care of everything. So yeah, they work closely. But yeah, it's gonna be pretty basic care until either the ferry comes to transport a patient, or a helicopter. So if the skies are clear and we're able to fly, a lot of the life flight activity is actually going out to offshore islands, Isle of Ho being one of them. But there are a lot of islands along the coast of Maine that have year-round communities and people living on them. And so life flight actually provides a lot of the transport for that. And then for less emergent things, it's ferries. I was working a shift in Bar Harbor, and I had a teenager come in like with wrist pain, and she's telling me what was going on. And she was saying, I fell yesterday jumping, or they were playing tag or something like that. And I'm like, well, that's weird. Why did you injure your arm yesterday? I think it was broken. And then, come in midday the next day. And then like, oh, gotcha. You were out on the island. And so you'd missed the ferry last night. And so you came in on the ferry this morning. And that's something that if you're going to live on an island or spend a significant amount of time on the island, you're just sort of accepting that risk that it takes longer to get to the hospital, and you're going to have to be creative in how you get them off. Outside of ferry hours, there's huge fishing communities on these islands as well, or private boats. So, knowing someone with a boat to transport them is also a possibility too, though not the park's first go-to. I believe EMTs at some ski patrols are doing intranasal fentanyl. Yeah, I would love to do that. I know there was a paper in the Wilderness Medical Society journal maybe a year ago, maybe actually last winter, about, I believe it was a ski patrol in Utah where they had their ski patrollers giving intranasal fentanyl on the slopes. Super cool. I would love to do it. That is very cutting edge, and sort of on the line as far as liability, and it's far from sort of the accepted standard of care. Certainly to introduce that here, it would have to be part of a study, and the legwork to get that approved is going to be extensive. So yes, I think it's an awesome idea. I think it could have a lot of utility. Making it happen seems like a logistical nightmare in the current system that I'm working in. And that's sort of why I'm focusing on taking advantage of the physicians that are already independently licensed and often on scene. Because I think logistically and legally, that'll be an easier hurdle to overcome. But yeah, no, I think, maybe in years to come, we will see intranasal fentanyl being an option at lower provider levels. There are some things that are available overseas that just aren't approved by the FDA. I know there's I gotta look into it more, but there's a inhaled, like comes in an inhaler pain medication that's more common in Australia and is carried by like BLS level providers. So there are things out there. But with anything in healthcare and the FDA, yeah, Penthrox. Thank you. I don't know a whole lot about it. I have no personal experience with it, but seems like a cool option that we would have to get through the FDA, maybe sometime.
All right, we're coming up on the hour. If anyone has any last minute questions, speak now. Otherwise, I'll start wrapping things up here. So thank you again, Dr. Swinburne. That was really great presentation. I love these search and rescue themed talks. And I think we learned a lot about Acadia and search and rescue in general. So thanks again. To our audience, thanks for joining us. Make sure to fill out that Google form I posted if you want some free swag from Pit Viper. And stay tuned for our next lecture in 2 weeks.